Greetings once again, this is the Prim Reaper, and this is the third video in my series critiquing feminist issues. I was originally going to cover 2 to 3 separate issues in this video, as I have been doing previously, but the issue I began to write about was the topic of female genital mutilation, and I had written nearly 2 pages before I realized that this video would be way too long if I tried to cover more than just this. So basically, this video wound up turning into a discussion on both male and female circumcision, and an interesting cultural case study involving the latter. Please forgive me for jumping around a little bit in this video. I've added points here and there as I've thought of them, and so certain elements of this might seem a little more disjointed than usual. The reason for this is basically because I know that this is a highly sensitive topic for a lot of people, with good reason. And as always, I want to try to give everyone the proper respect as I go over everything. I was a little surprised. It was actually quite a draining topic to go over, but I definitely think it's important to talk about. Now, as I said, I'm prefacing my discussion of female genital mutilation with the male circumcision topic, because these two always inevitably seem to be discussed together, with one side saying they're equivalent, and the other side saying they're not even remotely comparable. Now, as with many things, my viewpoint falls somewhere in the middle, and I'll try to clearly explain my reasons why here. First of all, let's begin with the reason I find them similar. Looking up the term mutilation yields the definition to injure, disfigure, or make imperfect by removing or irreparably damaging parts. Female genital mutilation, as you probably know, takes several different forms, the least of which involving the removal of the clitoral hood, which is rare, usually the clitoris is removed as well, and the most extensive of which involving the removal of the clitoral hood, the clitoris, and the inner labia, followed by the stitching together of the outer labia to produce only a tiny hole at the bottom for urine and menstrual fluid to go through. According to the United Nations Population Fund website, the most common types of FGM are type 1, which usually involves the removal of the clitoral hood and the clitoris, and type 2, which includes everything in type 1 as well as the inner labia. But either way, my point is that it's highly common for the clitoris to be removed. Male circumcision involves the removal of the foreskin, a functional part of penile anatomy, in differing extents depending on how far down the shaft the cut is made. By definition, both male and female circumcision involve mutilating the genitals. This being established, and for my ease of speaking, I'll be referring to both forms of circumcision as MGM and FGM for the most part for the rest of this video. A lot of times, both MGM and FGM is performed on individuals who do not or cannot consent, and this violation of human integrity should not be seen as an acceptable thing for either side. One way in which many people argue that MGM is a larger issue than FGM is that it is still legal in most areas of the world, and as a result, it affects many more men than FGM affects women. Another valid point. However, there are also reasons that I don't think the two procedures are fully comparable. Anatomically speaking, the removal of the foreskin is comparable to the removal of the clitoral hood. As I already mentioned, when female genital mutilation is performed, usually the clitoris is removed as well. This is closer to removing the entire head of the penis rather than just the foreskin. Although tenuous and seemingly always changing, some doctors espouse some potential benefits to MGM, while there are no comparable benefits to FGM. And on that note, even searching Google for the phrase male circumcision declining yields several articles on the first page alone explaining why this is a problem in some doctors' opinions. It's slightly more difficult to give parents hell for circumcising their sons when their doctor, someone they presumably see as a legitimate medical source, is suggesting that their son be circumcised. Furthermore, conditions such as phimosis are possible to arise involving the foreskin, whereas no comparable disorders exist that arise necessitating FGM. Though, as another aside, I don't see this as a valid reason to remove the foreskin in infancy any more than I support preemptive appendix removal. Complications, while possible in both procedures, are much more common in FGM than MGM. You can go into any online discussion of male circumcision and see some men who either don't care or even appreciate the fact that they were circumcised, some men that wish they had been circumcised when they were young enough to not remember it, or some men who had the circumcision done later in life who appreciated their penis more after being circumcised. My husband is one person who enjoys the fact that he was circumcised as an infant and resents the use of the word mutilation to describe it as such. His own words are, "The word mutilation carries a heavily negative connotation, and I don't feel that way about my dick." On the other hand, FGM is much more typically widely reviled by everyone involved. For the purposes of a complete discussion on this topic, I can say that, having reviewed as much evidence as I possibly could, the information directs me to believe that FGM, the risks and the reasons behind it, are typically worse than MGM and the reasons behind it. If I were to try and summarize my view in a different way, you could say that I think MGM is a much more widespread issue than FGM due to its worldwide legality, but I think that the procedure of FGM itself, when directly compared to MGM, is physically worse, in the same way that removing a front tooth for purely cosmetic and social purposes would be worse than removing a wisdom tooth prematurely to avoid potential future risks. I want to stress yet again that I think performing either procedure on an individual that cannot consent to it or does not have an underlying medical condition necessitating it is wrong. I always seem to see two camps of people whenever I see this topic come up. There are those that think both procedures are 100% equally bad and should never be performed under any circumstances, and then those who absolutely refuse to see male circumcision as even close to a comparable problem to FGM and are offended that anyone could even suggest such a thing. I don't see why it's unreasonable to suggest that, whether or not one might technically be more harmful than the other, we should work to reduce or even eliminate both procedures, at least those performed on infants or other non-consenting individuals. I think that some people worry that if they're not treated as equal harms, they won't be equally worked against in society. However, I think that talking like both procedures are one-to-one perfectly equal makes a lot of people more unsympathetic to those talking about MGM because they're more likely to just dismiss them outright. This is what I mean when I say it's a sensitive topic. You have to be very careful about how you discuss the issues because it's easy to be misunderstood or to piss someone off by phrasing something in the wrong way. But I hope that I've gotten my views across clearly so far. I think that people should do whatever they want to their own bodies, but they have to make that choice themselves. I therefore feel most consistent in saying that no form of circumcision, or really any other non-medically necessary body modifications for that matter, should be allowed without an individual's consent. Fortunately, MGM does appear to be on a decline in the world, and many doctors are beginning to agree that, typically, the proposed benefits do not outweigh the potential risks. This is good news. But despite this extremely long tangent, this article focused on feminist issues is mainly talking about female genital mutilation, so I will go back to talking about that in specific. FGM is still unfortunately common in many areas of the world. It is largely perpetuated by older women, typically family members or in-laws, within a given community for several different reasons: as a rite of passage, as a preparation for what is to be expected in marriage or childbirth, done to encourage chastity, or performed as a result of an erroneous belief that certain parts of the female anatomy are unclean. As I already mentioned very briefly before, while some argue that MGM can offer some benefits, FGM offers absolutely no such physical benefits and is usually only performed as a result of social pressures. On the other hand, the harms it confers are both immediate, such as intense pain, excessive bleeding, and infections, and potentially long-term, such as scar tissue, sexual difficulties and pain, and increased risks during childbirth. The World Health Organization has, over the last decade, been increasing efforts to spread education and advocacy against the procedure throughout the most affected areas in the world, and it does seem like the amount of women undergoing FGM is going down almost everywhere, which is great, but there's obviously still a long way to go. One thing that struck my interest was an article I found while researching about FGM, which I'll naturally link in the description. It's titled, "Why Some Women Choose to Get Circumcised," and it examines the experience of an anthropology professor who traveled to Kenya and talked with a member of a community there about female circumcision as a normal part of their marriage ceremony. The women underwent the genital cutting process with pride, stoicism, and took almost immediately to dancing after the procedure was completed. These Kenyan women at one point responded with disgust at the notion that the anthropologist had delivered children uncircumcised. Interestingly, at one point in the article, the anthropologist suggests that it should be referred to as female genital cutting rather than mutilation due to the negative connotation. It's just interesting to see this when referred to FGM rather than MGM. The way this article talks about FGM and the way this community sees it as a point of pride made me sit and scratch my head for a few minutes. After all, in Western cultures, FGM is seen as a pretty universal harm. However, it's not difficult to find many examples of tribes performing unusual rituals or rites of passage that we would see as horrible or even barbaric. Examples of this are the bullet ant gloves of the Sateri Mawe tribe, where young boys must wear gloves lined with bullet ants, well known as one of, if not the most painful stings inflicted in the world, while they dance. The boys must be able to perform this dance without shedding a tear to demonstrate their manliness, which generally means doing this multiple times. Another example is the Itoro tribe, which suggests that boys must drink the semen of older men in order to grow into strong men themselves. Several other nearby tribes in the New Guinea area have a similar philosophy, though they feel that the semen is best delivered to the young boys anally. A more relevant example of a cultural norm that many Westerners find objectionable is the covering of women's bodies seen in cultures that follow Islam. There are many different forms that this takes, from the hijab, which covers only the hair, to the burqa, which covers everything and includes only a mesh through which women can see. Now, I won't get into my personal thoughts on anything to do with Islam for now, as it is a broad topic in itself, and this video is already going to be pretty long. But there is rather a lot of controversy regarding whether or not these kinds of clothing are oppressive to women. Some argue that these garbs are oppressive because it suggests that women's bodies are naturally immodest and that the men can't be expected to control themselves if they see women's faces. Saudi Arabia is one country that actually enforces a dress code, requiring women to wear an abaya, a long cloak that covers the clothing, and a headscarf or hijab that covers the hair, though more covering is considered more modest and therefore preferable. However, many argue that these women are choosing to wear more modest clothing, and therefore it cannot be oppressive. Look at the outrage surrounding the burkini ban in France in 2016. Many people argued that banning the burkini, even if itself was seen as an oppressive article of clothing by some people, would be more oppressive just by nature of dictating by law what women were allowed to wear. The topic of whether Muslim women are truly free to choose their clothing when there are strong social and religious pressures to cover up and be modest is a difficult topic, but it relates back to the Kenyan community that the anthropologist visited. Even if these women are accepting FGM proudly as a means of entering womanhood, with the amount of social pressure that they receive from family members and in-laws to undergo the procedure, are they really making this choice freely? If organizations such as the WHO or the UN try to enforce laws against FGM in areas like these, is this then restricting these women's choices to undergo the procedure? What lengths should the world go to prevent harms from being done to women without restricting their freedoms? It's actually a rather tricky thing to try to argue, especially when some people become so hysterical about it. Hell, look at the hullabaloo that went up when the NHS in the UK included consensual genital piercings in their numbers of women suffering FGM. It's clearly a topic that can cause some people to overreach in their desire to protect women, but if pushed too far, it can swing into oppressing people's freedoms as well, so we have to be wary of this. What would I think is the best course of action when it comes to situations like this? I think that broad, sweeping bans, despite cultural norms, however much we may see them as backwards or harmful, will never work out terribly well. I think that the best course of action would be in trying to educate people that FGM is not necessary in order to be clean or to become a proper woman. As much as I wish that we lived in a world where everyone agreed that slicing up genitals was a generally unnecessary thing to do, we do not. But with both MGM and FGM, the numbers do seem to be declining, which is an encouraging trend. Anyway, I think that I'm going to end the video here. This is actually quite a difficult subject to talk about because it really raises people's hackles either way. The only thing that I can say for certain is that I think that we should strive wherever possible to move towards ending these procedures being committed against people that cannot consent to them. I think that's really all it comes down to for me, the right to one's own bodily integrity, wherever possible. As always, I appreciate seeing your thoughts and viewpoints in the comments. The best way to a broad perspective is a broad discussion, after all. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll hope to see you for the next one.